Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Now, sorry for disappearing on you all. Your podcast host is currently going through some mixed emotions here in Nashville, Tennessee. On one hand, I'm incredibly excited about having the opportunity to both attend and cover Emma's Marketing United event, being able to hear firsthand keynotes about the future of voice search and the role of AI in storytelling. But yesterday, my airline lost my luggage. So yesterday I spent much of the day speaking with insurers and ended up hitting downtown Nashville looking for emergency supplies. But all I could find was cowboy boots, which did make me think about adopting the look. I mean, after all, I am a man of a certain age and I reckon I could pull it off, don't you? So for anyone that does know Nashville, I got an Uber to the Grand Ole Opry and there's a nearby mall there so I could pick up toiletries, underwear, etc. I know, too much information, right? But I just wanted to share just how rock and roll my life is. But enough of my first world problems, because before I hit that show floor at Emma's Marketing United, I wanted to give the hardcore techies that listen to this show something to get excited about, and that's block storage, and the more in favour, object storage today. So I invited Clayton Weiss on the show. Now he's the Director of Cloud Services for KeyInfo Systems, and he's coming on the show to discuss object storage topics such as what factors different industries need to consider for storing data, especially now we're in a world of compliance and regulation, etc. And we're also going to discuss how object storage is a big change from what businesses have done in the past, and what types of industries are actually using object storage now. Clayton is also going to encouraging them to consider object storage, and also why it's a popular choice over block storage, which is the more traditional method, and also how it can address those rapid data growth problems. And we also talk about the best practices when implementing an object storage strategy. So this one is a real treat for techies, but also for anyone interested in just knowing more about the differences between block storage and the increasingly popular object storage. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to California so we can speak with Clayton Weiss, the Director of Cloud Services for KeyInfo. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
So my name is Clayton Weiss. I work for a company called Key Information Systems, or KeyInfo. And I'm in charge of everything cloud related here at Key, both in terms of our cloud strategy and what we're doing as a company, and also our cloud offerings and what we provide to our clients. Little background about me: I have always worked at service providers. So my very first job was in an ISP, and I've pretty much worked at ISPs ever since. I started out in the dial-up days of internet way back when, and have been kind of working my way through the industry ever since. I've been sort of spoiled rotten, always been sitting on top of huge internet pipes. So in the days of dial-up, it was obviously torture to go home because I was used to sitting on an OC48 and then I would come home to 28K. So it was a little bit of a change. I used to kind of hack residential ISDN lines to get them to bond together and use it as if it were a commercial ISDN line to dial in and at least get 112K of bandwidth. So that was better than the 2880 I was getting. So I was flying with broadband at that point. So I've always worked at ISPs. It's been my entire background. So from everything from the connectivity side of it to the hosting side of it, we ran a hosting outfit. We had mail clusters that ran 18,000 mailboxes and a number of other different services we had on top of that. Hosting services, we did managed hosting and those things. And so we kind of built everything from the ground up. My background as a result of working at the ISP is sort of largely on the networking side. I think I have a lot more WAN experience than maybe a typical, let's say, network engineer or someone you might run into. But we went from servers and storage and networking and all the different components to the actual construction of 2 data centers. Where we have regional co-location services that we provide. And then sort of recently, about 4 years ago, we were acquired by KeyInfo. And so I've been in charge of the cloud practice within Key to build out various offerings and other things.
I must admit, I feel compelled to ask you where your journey began with what ISP back in those dial-up days.
No one will ever know who they are. They were a very small regional service provider in Simi Valley, California called C&M Network. The C&M was Consumer Network Marketplace.
Yeah.
And that was one of those businesses that was literally started on the back of a napkin, was how they kind of mapped out what they were going to do in the areas they were going to service. And this was early days of the internet. CNN was one of the very first COVAD DSL partners to reach into a name. And actually IS West, which is the company I ended up moving to, was also one of the other first COVAD partners for DSL. So we were kind of on the leading edge of that type of connectivity back when. I mean, this is early days when a T1 connection would cost you, $3,000 a month, and you were happy to pay it because 1.5 megabits of bandwidth was screaming.
Well, kudos to you for not saying AOL or CompuServe, so at least we got that one out of the way. But for anyone listening that is hearing about key information systems for the very first time, can you just set the scene and tell me more about what kind of services you offer and also what problems you solve there?
Sure. So at Key's kind of an interesting company. We're a bit of a hybrid shop in that sense. So Key traditionally was a VAR, a reseller. So they were selling boxes and doing the integration work. And generally speaking, most of our clients were in kind of the mid-market to large enterprise space. So if you're going to measure it by revenue, it's kind of in the 200 million, 250 million, up to maybe 2 billion in annual revenue, average kind of size of the client base that we were working with. And they were a technology reseller and a professional services organization. So they'd sell you gear, they'd get it installed, they'd talk to you in 3 years when you're up for a refresh, right, and handle anything else kind of in between. But they didn't have a big managed services practice, and they certainly didn't have anything really in the cloud space. And so the CEO of the company, Leif Morin, had kind of this crazy idea, maybe there's something, this whole cloud thing, it might catch on. And so he decided, hey, well, let's pick up a company that's local to us, that's providing those services, and kind of roll it up into Key. And it's been a lot of fun because coming from when I was on the service provider side of things, we were on the far end of the acquisition. And what I mean by that is client would come to us when they already had equipment and say, hey, I have this equipment, I'd like to put it in your data center. How do I make all this work? And we'd give them some guidance and help them understand what it meant, because in the early days of co-location, it was kind of an unknown. A lot of people were used to building data rooms inside of their own office, so the idea of outsourcing that to a data center was still somewhat new, kind of, and certainly not known in the SMB space. It's really nice now to be able to have access to resources from like start to finish, where on the managed services side and on, say, the cloud side of things, right, you're dealing with everything that's happened after the gear has been purchased and integrated, right? So you're running it day to day. You're running your own environment, you're maintaining that environment, you're dealing with any of the things that come up on a day-to-day basis, which is what a lot of our clients would deal with after they purchase the equipment from us. So Key had kind of this split. So it's been a really great marriage between the two, because it allowed us to do not only, say, the equipment resale if it made sense for a client and we had things that we could provide to them, but to have the professional services and then also to do the cloud work. When we started on the path with cloud, so I was an really early adopter of cloud. When I first got involved in our cloud offerings at IS West, OpenStack was on its second release. They had just gone to Bexar, and at that point, even NASA and Rackspace were like 10-foot pole, don't touch it, it's totally unstable, it's a great little experiment, let's just see what it turns into. And it had a lot of hype, but we needed something that was production ready. So we were actually an early adopter of what used to be called VMOps that eventually became Cloud.com, which eventually evolved into CloudStack. And so on the IS West side of things, we had our own little CloudStack environment that we had built out, and we had kind of maintained that over the years. And so we had some experience in doing that. KeyInfo came in and said, hey, we want to do the same thing. We want to expand those offerings. And there's this funny system, you may have heard of it, called the AS400 or IBMI. And we want to host those in a cloud environment too. And my initial reaction, coming from kind of the ISP world, I had never worked with any of those IBM systems before. So I was kind of looking like, don't you need a hand crank for those? Because I haven't seen one in like 15 years. And they said, no, actually, they're kind of everywhere, and a lot of our clients use it. And so the goal was to sort of integrate all those services together. When I started down the path in terms of what our offerings were looking like, we were focused on things that were similar to like AWS, right? And Azure was still in its infancy in terms of adoption rates, right? And Google was more or less non-existent in the cloud space. You had like SoftLayer and Rackspace and those types of guys too, but all of it was focused on infrastructure, and that was the original goal. And what we found out in the span of a few years is that our original intentions were completely wrong. nobody cared about infrastructure, and all of our clients were far more interested in disaster recovery and backup. And so that just sort of, just by nature of happenstance to some extent, sort of became what we really ended up getting into. Because what I discovered is I came from kind of an SMB world. And in an SMB world, you're sort of given this, guys, you have to compete with your larger competitors, but you have a budget of like $5 to do it. And so it forces a certain amount of creativity because you're sort of understaffed and under-resourced. And so you're contracting out what you can, you're sort of doing what you can to compete. In the mid-market space, it's the exact same problem, just on a different scale. So it was kind of funny. I thought that, hey, if you're a $500 million company, you've got disaster recovery solved. And then I would have these meetings with clients, and we go through and say, what's your DR plan? They're like, well, we load the tape and we pray. And then, that's our DR plan. And so when we started getting into it, we started realizing that, there were a lot of areas because we had expertise in a lot of the specialized technology that we were selling, and also from the service provider side, in the ability to run that equipment, we were looking at going, okay, we have all this infrastructure that we've built out, and we have all these management tools and automation, all the things that we've done to do infrastructure services. What if we just did those infrastructure services opportunistically? Instead of having a workload that always ran, what if it ran when you do a DR test and when a client had a disaster? And so we started building out a DR practice and have really kind of shaped ourselves around that. We've expanded since. We have presence here in Southern California. We have presence with Switch, which is a data center company. We're in Las Vegas, in Reno, and in Grand Rapids, Michigan. There's some discussion about expanding out. Switch is building out a facility out in Atlanta, Georgia. So we may end up looking to expand operations out there as well. And then we're also looking to start building out, because what we've sort of discovered is for a number of our clients right now, when we talk about backup and we talk about DR, they're kind of looking for a like-for-like to their current systems, to their current infrastructure, in a way that makes it sort of easy to translate, right? Anyone who has attempted to lift and shift into a cloud, just like, hey, let's take our production application and throw it into Amazon, has sort of discovered the pain that goes with that. Yeah. And the pain is sort of a multitude of things. One, cloud systems are built differently than enterprise systems. They're built around unpredictability and instability, right? It's in the old networking days, right? The assumption is the network is unstable, and so you build with that in mind. In a traditional enterprise environment, the assumption is the environment is completely and totally stable and rock solid. In an Amazon world, if a physical host in the AWS data center crashes, too bad, sucks to be you. You should have built your application better to be able to kind of scale and, to use CloudWatch and to do monitoring and to do things to properly handle what's going to occur in a cloud environment, right? It's the pets versus cattle debate. Yeah. And in the mid-market and enterprise space, most of those applications, they're all still pets, right? So to try and cram that into a public cloud environment doesn't really work. So we get into this discussion of how we bridge that gap, right, and how you do in between. And so in those areas, then it makes sense to say, hey, what if we could just rent an environment in the way that we needed it, use the same type of cloud model, but in a way that fits our more traditional infrastructure. And so we have that. On the backup side of things, same thing. We ended up building out our own object ring. So we have our own S3 compatible object ring that we built out between the three locations. We do it a little bit different than some of the cloud providers do, in the sense that it's actually similar to like Azure and their geographically replicated storage, where we take data that's written into the object store and we distribute it between those three facilities in Vegas, Reno, Grand Rapids. And so we have that split there, so we can actually lose an entire data center and still have all of the data in the object store read-write accessible. So if we look at, say, object as an alternative to tape for archive, it poses some great options. And then it's a whole suite of services kind of based around it. And so, yeah, when we first started this journey, the thought was we're going to do infrastructure, and what we found out is no one cares. And really what they're interested in is kind of this, a lot of them still had very traditional views of how they handled their backups, how they handled their disaster recovery, and how they handled kind of their sort of large amounts of unstructured data. And so we're helping to sort of modernize that. And then the next step for us is to start building this out and how we leverage those same services into the public cloud space. We're not quite there yet in terms of where we feel comfortable firming up an offering, but we know that is sort of the next step, because more and more we're starting to see the modernization of workloads and sort of the acceptance of where cloud fits into the picture. When cloud first came out in terms of public clouds, the initial reaction was move everything to public cloud. It's going to be amazing. It'll save us money. And what ended up happening, of course, is people realized, oh my God, all my problems just moved to another data center. I didn't fix anything. And now it's remote and I have to manage it differently. And so they pulled everything back. And then for some, there were a lot of concerns about security. What we've seen now is a sort of normalization where people have an understanding and companies have an understanding of how the public cloud fits into things. And so the initial piece right now that we see a lot of is, hey, let's build this public cloud app. Let's throw the developers at it. And we're going to do this way, but we're still going to manage our environment traditionally. And so we have this sort of split. And that's where we come in because we can help out in terms of both for providing protection to the existing traditional environment, providing consulting for how to protect the new environment, because just because you've moved a workload into cloud doesn't mean you're actually protecting it correctly. Right? It's not just solving a scaling issue. If you haven't constructed that application properly to be, cross-region or at least between availability zones or something along those lines where you have some type of redundancy, if you haven't thought that through, or like a lot of people, they may not have a backup strategy for that stuff. They tend to kind of be managed differently than the enterprise, and so we can help with that. And then on the traditional enterprise side, if you need the ability to protect and recover that type of information, then we have our own environment where it might make sense to leverage that. And so then there's this suite of services that goes around it that we can sort of assist clients with. So it's been a real interesting journey, and I'm kind of looking forward to what starts to come next, because we're going to start to see some modernization now of what happens on-premise in the enterprise data centers as they start to transition to more of a cloud-like model. The one thing that I can say that is currently kind of the biggest blocker in all of this, and especially when it comes to the term quote-unquote hybrid cloud, is hybrid cloud is kind of a cloud-washed term.
Yeah.
It's thrown around a lot in marketing documentation. I remember when cloud first came out, like it was grid computing and then it was cloud computing. And when it was cloud, every single major manufacturer was like, we have cloud everything. And it's just like, no, you just took that and stuck it in someone else's data center. That's not cloud. There's been a similar sort of reaction that's happened with hybrid cloud, right? You don't buy a hybrid cloud. You just sort of have it because you have data here and data there and some other information here and systems over there. And before you know it, your data's sort of in multiple cloud environments, including your own internal environment. And hey, you're hybrid now. The biggest blocker in all this actually has been the network. So if we look at it in historical context, right, virtualization really kind of set the path for what became cloud computing because it abstracted the operating system from the actual piece of hardware it was running on. It gave you portability of that, right? And so now the hardware was, the server was no longer my domain controller or my mail server. It was a server, and then it just happened to be running different virtual machines that were performing different tasks. So that abstraction freed up what the server was supposed to do and made it a more generic tool, made it a resource pool that everything sort of sat on top of, right? And because users don't care about servers, they care about the application they're using to do their job. And so that layer of abstraction provided this great ability to have portability and flexibility of those different systems. And that sort of laid the groundwork of what eventually became cloud. We've seen the storage environment start to make that evolution over the last few years, where more and more storage vendors used to be all specialized hardware, doing everything in ASIC, and more they're starting to realize, like, no, really, it's just a Linux box with a bunch of fancy software on it, on a generic Intel board with hard drives behind it, right? And your fancy storage system is really just cool software. That sort of realization and acceptance, now we're starting to see that a lot of hardware manufacturers that made specialized storage system also have a software version of their same thing that, hey, you can run it on anything. You can run it on KVM, on VMware, you run it AWS and Azure. So they're starting to have that level of abstraction. The network doesn't have that yet, right? Our networks are still married to the device. We have this thing where the operating system of the network is tied to the specific type of and model of switch, and all of those things are nailed down in static configurations to specific ports on certain VLANs, and it's all very old. It's all very static. And so as we start to see an adoption of network virtualization tools, right, whether it's something sort of mainstream like NSX or something slightly more targeted to a specific market, like a big switch or Plum Grid or one of those types of things. The concept is the same in terms of what you're trying to do now is abstract the network that's carrying all the traffic you care about from the physical network that happens to be holding the path. And I think as we start to see that shift, then we'll really start to see the promise of what will actually become, in my head, hybrid cloud. Right. For now, it's still very much two disparate environments with a thin little network cable between the two, and we haven't quite figured out how to really have workload portability between them because the network is still getting in the way. Once we start to evolve that, then I think we'll really start to see some true evolution of it doesn't matter where it is because the network is all the same either way, or how we transport it. You just happen to run a workload here because it makes sense, or a workload there because it makes sense, and everything can communicate with each other across this virtual network that spans, any number of different paths to get there.
So what are the biggest challenges actually facing your clients when they come and knock on your door? Is it that like-for-like lift and shift, or lack of DR or backup strategy, or is it just lack of resources or expertise, or is it something completely different?
It's sort of a conflation of all those things.
Yeah.
So part of it is that what we've generally found is the teams that work in, like, say, the mid-market companies, they're very good at understanding the applications they run. They're very good at understanding the process and procedures and things for the business. They're not necessarily as practiced in some of the more specialized operations, and that's why they would outsource. So, for example, when you talk about system integration, right? They're not installing that particular model of storage array or server on a regular basis. We are. So when it comes time to do those major tasks, they're going to look to us to provide that level of service. When it comes to disaster recovery or backup services, right? Backup is sort of a thankless job. If you do it right, you don't get fired. If you do it wrong, you do get fired. Like, there's no one ever pats you on the back for doing a good job backups. It's sort of expected. And as a result, no one really wants to take the reins on it and sort of own it. And so as a result, you kind of look to see, hey, can I outsource this? Can I have someone who specializes in this particular operation to do that for me? And that's where we've started to see, a lot of rising interest. Disaster recovery is another one of those areas. There are a lot of kind of do-it-yourselfers that maybe we're going to SunGuard or BCRS, where you kind of show up tapes in hand and be like, all right, let's load everything and bring it back up. The problem, of course, with that model is it takes a very long time. You're talking days for recovery. And, we live in a world now where if you're down for an hour, right, everyone starts to look at you like you have two heads. So if your disaster recovery plan consists of, a week of coming back online, that's not a DR plan. That's just file our insurance claim. We're out of business. Thank you very much, and go away. And so where they start to look towards us is for the consulting efforts that we can help with on that. And then for the management of what that actually looks like as a target environment. And then finally, for the ability to kind of recover properly and what that means. And the recovery could be backups, the recovery could be DR, it's any number of different things that sort of all tie this stuff together. I was just going to
say, why is it, do you think, that your clients now are starting to consider object storage? And why do you think that's a popular choice over the block storage?
Yeah, it's a multifaceted answer on that one.
Yeah.
One is object poses a very cool alternative to tape. And I've yet to run into anybody that runs up and says, you know what I love to do? I love to manage my tapes. So everyone hates that. No one wants to deal with it. Object provides this great alternative. If I need data and it's on a tape and that tape's in a warehouse, some person has to go into the warehouse, retrieve the tape, get it on a truck, drive it out, deliver it to me. I got to load it in a library, go through their server. We're talking hours, if not a day, right, to do that recovery. It's a pain in the butt. If I have that same data and it's an object store, I request the object, get the object, problem solved. So we have this sort of instant availability of that information, but at a much cheaper cost, for example, than storing on traditional storage. The other sort of advantage that, say, object provides, and where we see a lot of it, be it backup or archive, or medical images or those types of things that clients are doing, is there's the convenience aspect of it. There's the cost aspect of it, and then the other side of it is it's paying for what you consume, right? So we're going to over provision when we buy things on our own because you want to make sure you have overhead. I don't buy just enough tapes to do my backups. I have extras because I need to make sure as I go through rotation, I don't have to wait 2 weeks for new tape stock to arrive or something along those lines, right? Yeah. In the same way that we don't build out to 100% capacity, you build out to 200% capacity and you have that room for growth. Object lets you grow 1 gig at a time. So it provides a really, really fair model because you're just going to pay for what you're consuming. And so the areas that have seen the largest, and this is actually probably one of the largest areas of growth in the cloud environment that we've seen a lot of our clients adopt, they might deploy some applications out in the cloud, but where a lot of the infrastructure teams that are running the traditional things where they're largely adopting cloud is not in cloud workloads, but in cloud storage. Because to go through the process of acquiring equipment and doing the installation and getting everything tied together, it's all very time consuming, and just sometimes even getting a purchase order might take you a while. Whereas in a cloud environment, I need more storage, I get more storage, right? So it has this sort of infinitely scalable, pay for what you consume type of a model. And the biggest drawback I think that a lot of people run into is they don't realize how much data they have. No one has really sat down to do the calculation. And if you're a hospital and you have tapes going back 10 years, you haven't really thought about how much space that actually is. You just think of it as, I have 400 tapes in a warehouse somewhere. If you sat down and you did the calculus, you'd realize, oh my gosh, I have 8 petabytes worth of data sitting in a bunker somewhere. If you go and think of it in terms of cloud, all of a sudden you realize, oh my gosh, that data costs me money. So I think the biggest thing that most people run into is not necessarily realizing the amount of storage they actually have kind of sitting out there and how it's sort of represented. And you see it twofold. You see it, one, in the consumption of the storage itself, and then two, in the realization of, oh my gosh, I have to pay to get access to this data, right? S3 might cost you 3 cents a gig to put it in there, but it'll cost you 9 cents a gig to pull it out, right? They're charging you a premium to get your data because that's where the cost is, right? The cost isn't necessarily in storing it. So it's just where we have to make sure we educate our clients on what it means for them overall. In our particular case, since we have our own ring, for clients that have access to that directly, we can do it on like a flat rate. So hey, 10 gig connection into the ring, all yours, have at it, use it to your heart's content, and it's a flat rate. And that is something that's fairly unique to us. But in general, it's the education. Where we've seen the biggest adoption is in unstructured data and in backups. And what the makeup of that unstructured data is obviously varies largely by industry. And the other piece then that we've seen the interest in is, okay, how do we start having some type of a system that understands my lifecycle management, starts to categorize that data, of move it out of primary into secondary, tertiary storage, right? Because object is a separate protocol. And you've got block, which we've known for years. We've got fiber channel, iSCSI, FCOE, and InfiniBand and whatever else. We have those standards. Those have been set for a long time. Right? We've got file, that's been around for a long time too in terms of NAS. Object is new, right? So object is this idea of a mathematical guess. We get our scalability by using an algorithm to distribute the data. So we now no longer have to, within the storage system, track metadata in the same way that we do with a block or a file system. So we get this great scalability, but it comes with the sacrifice of performance. And you're not going to run your RDBMS inside of an object store. You might store some reports in there, right? But you're certainly not going to run it like directly out of that because performance is just not going to be good. So for content that we might consider active archive, where it's data that's fairly cold but you still access it on a somewhat regular basis, object is a great option.
I've also read a lot recently about how it's addressing rapid data growth that can come with things like police body cams, healthcare files, which you mentioned there very briefly. But can you expand on that and those real-world situations and how it's helping?
Absolutely. So you mentioned, for example, healthcare, right? Yeah. There's an acronym of VNA, Vendor Neutral Archive, which is this ability if you've got a medical imaging like a PACS system or something like that where you're storing X-rays or MRI data or things along those lines. Those files are pretty large. And a lot of the traditional approach was just buy more primary storage, and that becomes a very expensive way to store that data. Object poses a great alternative for that because all that data is, kind of by its nature unstructured, and all of object data is by its nature unstructured. And so it poses this great kind of option to put the data in an object store. The other advantage that the object store has, of course, is this infinite scalability. There are limitations to what you can do on a block or a file system. There are no limitations necessarily to what you can do within an object store. Objects storage can grow to petabytes or exabytes and it's all still one global namespace. So they give you this great sort of pool to just throw all the data into and let it sort of grow infinitely. You mentioned police body cams and those things, right? So a number of states have started implementing laws that require officers to wear body cams and record those types of footage. Now there's this massive explosion of growth, and nobody knows where to put this data, right? You can continue to buy disk to throw it on, but that has its limitations, both in terms of cost and scalability. Object is a great way to keep that data because it gives you the sort of resiliency of that data being distributed across a large number of disparate systems in kind of a shared nothing type architecture, and in a way that you don't have to plan for growth, you just have to consume, right? So it makes it very, very easy, and it also makes your cost very predictable because you know your cost per gig or your cost per terabyte. And if you have your projection of what it looks like, you just have this direct correlation, and it's just a one-for-one. So it makes it very easy to kind of model out and have an understanding of how you're going to consume that and over what period of time.
So for anyone listening, what, in your opinion, what are the best practices when implementing an object storage strategy? Probably a big question, isn't it?
It is a big question. So if it's a matter of implementing an object storage strategy, I think the first thing is to do an analysis of what's the challenge you're trying to solve. Yeah. There's a misnomer to some extent that cloud is just cheaper automatically. That's not really true. But what you have to look at is, what do you do as an organization? If you're not a storage company, if that's not your business, then get out of it, right? And so one of the values that, say, a cloud or an object provider can provide is the ability to essentially have that service outsourced. So you simply consume what you need. So it's important, one, to kind of look at it. The other piece is to look at what are the requirements around this? Are there requirements for compliance, for governance? How does this information have to be tracked? And then that sort of drives the next series of questions of the technical implementation of, okay, how do these things need to be accessed, right? Object is a new protocol. It's not uncommon, although we're seeing it more and more now starting to gain popularity, but it's not uncommon for most applications and certainly most systems and servers and operating systems to not support the object protocol natively, right? Windows cannot mount an S3 object store without some third-party piece of software. Same thing on the Linux side, right? So if you have to have some other piece of software to do that, right, how does all that tie into all the previous questions of control and governance and access and everything else? And then it becomes a question of performance. There are, for example, there are gateways out there, right? And there's a whole number of them, Panzer and Asuni, what have you. What is it, AltaVault, and various ones. And what they allow you to do is take your object storage and present it out as a regular NAS. And that's actually where we've seen a lot of popularity of how to adopt object storage is through some type of a gateway, because they provide access through traditional universally accepted means on protocols that have been around for 10, 15, 20 years. So you have the traditional form of access that sort of buffers between you and the object store. And interesting enough, what they also do is provide a level of acceleration too. Right? In a lot of cases, those devices might do some compression and deduplication of the data. So you're reading and writing less data out of the cloud, which can improve performance. And then they have some caching mechanism too, where they're going to keep that data local. So if it's a file server and you've got 50 terabytes worth of data sitting in there, maybe the 2 terabytes you access most frequently, which are the 2 terabytes you just wrote to it, because most of the time the data we just put in is the data we're going to pull out, is what you're using. So it'll keep that data local. So it provides, to some extent, some form of, I'm going to use the term WAN acceleration, and I know I'm sort of butchering what that really means, but in the sense that it's doing certain WAN acceleration type things, but then also what it's doing is providing that kind of local caching of that content. And so that tends to be the ways that the object storage gets to be consumed.
So are you also noticing any big trends for the cloud, or do you have any prediction of where you think the industry is actually heading?
Yes. I have my private thoughts on the matter. So there was a big push and a big pull in terms of, oh my God, we're going to put everything in cloud, and oh my gosh, take it all out. And so now I think there's a normalization and an understanding. And so I think I mentioned this before. I think the next big wave of change that will come to the cloud side of things is going to be what happens on the network end. Mm-hmm. I think that is really the one remaining piece that is vastly slowing down the adoption of cloud. And it's part of the reason, interesting enough, why storage is probably as popular as it is in cloud adoption in terms of hybrid cloud or in terms of enterprises leveraging it, because those protocols are fairly well established. And with the use of things like gateways or certain technology that integrates with it, it makes the adoption of it pretty simple. And storage is storage. It's a bunch of stuff, right? It's a little bit different when we talk about the network that's carrying all the interactions between the applications, because now we get into all sorts of dirty stuff of how the different components of those applications have to talk, what are their latency tolerances, what does this mean for IP addressing and everything else. And we still haven't really broken out of that world yet. So I think as we start to see more and more virtualization of the network, I think we're also going to see a fairly accelerated pace of, I want to say, cloud adoption in terms of the ability to have workloads portable between on-premise and off-premise in a way that we currently do not have today. The other, and this is, I know for me, probably an unpopular opinion to some extent, but I actually think containers have a pretty limited lifespan. They're all the rage. They were last year, right? They're pretty much well established in popularity as they stand now. But if you really break it down and you look at, what's a container, right? I'm going to go way back to containers when we used to sort of jail off applications and create our own little virtual Linux jails inside of the same operating system, and it more or less was the brainchild of what eventually became LXC and then Docker and all the rest of it, right? And if you break it down to its beginnings, a Docker container, or it doesn't have to be Docker, right? But a container in general is a fake shell of an operating system, just enough of one to be able to run an application. So, and then what's the purpose of that application? Well, the purpose of the application is data in, data out, right? Yeah. It's a feed of information that it's processing in some fashion. It could be something simple like Nginx or a web server that's processing data, or Kafka doing feeds, those types of things. Or it could be something slightly larger in terms of some function of like a database or something along those lines. But they tend to be this the microservice is a microservice only because it needs the appearance of an operating system in order to function. Where we've seen the growth in FAS, right, and things like Amazon Lambda and similar services, is, to me, I think what will eventually pretty much outstrip everything we're doing on the container side of things, because ultimately that's really what you're going after, is the abstraction, not the specific application, but feed data in, have it process in a certain way, push data out. And so if I'm making a prediction, looking in my crystal ball, it's that I think this huge rise in containers is going to start to decline and will be replaced by a huge rise in FAS-type services.
But as for you guys at Key Information Systems, what is your big focus for the next 18 months, would you say?
So the big focus right now is still on the backup and the DR side, just because it's where we've still seen the most interest and need from a lot of our clients. But I am very cognizant of the fact that only has so much runway, right? There are definitely companies that made a very good living doing disaster recovery services like SunGard and BCRS, and that's great. I think for us, it's taking those services and growing them into public cloud. So it's because it's the service that matters, right? It's the understanding of how to properly recover. The specific data center and the method in which we recover becomes less of a material question. Yeah. And it's the service around how to do it that matters. And then that feeds in the next discussion, which is you start out with, say, disaster recovery or backup recovery, right? And at some point, those two roads converge. We're starting to see more and more backup software looking at, why do I need to take a snapshot at a point in time? Why can't I just get a feed of data all the time and then just on the target side grab it out of the air at a certain point and say that's my backup? So we're going to start to see, I think, a convergence of backup tools turning into DR, and more of that starting to change. And so as that continues to happen, right, we're introducing more complexity and more specialized knowledge in how to do that. And I think we're going to see more and more interest in how to leverage that. So there's that. Then the other question is, okay, if we're doing this, right now it might make sense to do it in a more private environment like within our Key Cloud environment, but maybe it makes sense to do it in a public environment. Great. Well, then that for us becomes the next evolution, right? And that's what we're working on, is building out a suite of services that, we're going to look towards public cloud and have a good understanding of that. Well, then the next piece of it is we based our original set of offerings on this idea of infrastructure as a service. So we had a strong focus internally on orchestration and automation in a way that a traditional sort of mid-market company probably doesn't have, right? Or if they do have, they're just starting to build those skill sets. So now we've been in this world for the last 5 years doing these types of things. And at some point in the very near future, as cloud has become more and more adopted, not just for specialized applications like we're building this cloud app, but we need everything to interact in a certain way. There's going to be more and more pressure on the traditional infrastructure teams to adopt more of a DevOps model. So I see that there's probably some, and I couldn't tell you exactly how quite yet because I'm looking into 2019 on this one. But I think we're definitely going to see some crossover in skill sets, whether it hatches itself as some series of managed services around doing DevOps as a service type stuff, or it's integration work like what we've traditionally done on the professional services side of integration over the shoulder, that type of thing. But I think we're definitely going to see some growth of that in terms of how do we automate what we're doing internally within the organization to make it more cloud-like. And so that I think will start to come a little bit this year, but certainly into next year. And as I mentioned before, as the network starts to evolve, I think that becomes the major accelerator, right? That's the foot on the gas pedal for all of this, because right now it's kind of a blockade in how we do things. And once we start to do more and more automation and we look at, hey, how come I can't do this way on the network? You're going to start to look at different ways in which you run your network. And once we flatten that network between cloud and on-premise, now it doesn't matter where you are. And if we have now a common set of tools and a common set of orchestration things that we do, be it something like Puppet or Chef or RightScale or Morpheus or Clicker or what have you, Cisco Cloud Center, any number of those different things, right, that help you orchestrate against different environments, right, it starts to really flatten that offering out and make it so that you can just pick what you want to run your workload based on what makes the most sense.
Now, we have tackled some pretty big topics today, and I'm conscious there's going to be a lot of people listening probably wanting to find out more. So could I just ask that you remind them of where they can find you online and also contact your team if they've got any questions at all?
Yeah, absolutely. So people can find me. I have a LinkedIn page, and I'm, of course, accessible there. I have my profile up on the Key Information website. They can go to www.keyinfo.com, and that has all the information about KeyInfo. And then specifically, we have another website dedicated to just our cloud offerings, which is www.keycloud.com. That sort of describes all the things that we do on the cloud side of things for us. And then, of course, there's chat and email and forms and all the things to fill out to get in contact with anyone here at the organization. What I can say as a company is we are very accessible and very client-focused. It's one of the main reasons that I like working here, is it's very much a customer-focused company. I have on multiple occasions, our CEO is probably out traveling about 200 some odd days a year just doing client visits. And he's very involved in what we do with our clients. And the same thing is true, of course, with me and the rest of the executive staff here. And we're very interested because we tie a lot of what we do to what our clients need and what they're doing. And so we really do kind of view it as a relationship and a partnership and not just sort of, let me sell you some stuff, right? And I think that's an important distinction.
Absolutely. And a big thank you for coming on today, not only for talking about what you're doing there, but also sharing what trends you're seeing from your clients that are encouraging you to actually consider object storage and why it's actually a popular choice over block storage. So a big thank you for coming on and sharing your story today.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation.
I hope you enjoyed that, gang. Some great points raised there about trends in the industry and why the future is all about object storage. But before I go, I also wanted to give you a few more tales of my adventures out here. I bumped into the guy that played Jesus from the TV show Walking Dead at the airport. He's a very polite guy. He allowed me to grab a selfie with him, but he clearly wasn't in the mood for small talk, so I left him to it. But I did bump into a linebacker from Tennessee Titans who's just come over from Texas. I think he originated in Hawaii, but he was the nicest guy in the world and had a great chat with him. So if there are any football fans listening that know who he is, know who this new guy is that's recently signed for Tennessee Titans, let me know his name because I need to track him down about something. But I think that's enough excitement and adventures for one day, don't you? So I'm off to hit the show floor at Emma's Marketing United and I will return back with many interviews and maybe a few tales too. So a big thanks for listening. And until next time, Don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.